Okay friends, it's time to get started on replacing our front brakes. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheels are off the ground. After that, you're going to remove all 5 of your 22mm lug nuts and then the wheel. With the wheel off of there, you have a nice clear view of the brakes. The next thing that I always do is just come right up here to where you can see the flex hose connects onto the ABS wire. We're just going to separate the 2 of those. Now let's go ahead and take a pry bar and we're going to carefully push back the caliper pistons. Now to do this, I'm going to carefully get in between this area, gently pry in between the rotor and the caliper itself, and you'll watch it start pushing in those pistons. After you've done that, let's make our way to the back side of the caliper. You're going to be looking for 2 13mm headed bolts for the sliders. Go ahead and remove the pair. Leave this one in just a couple threads. Fully remove the top one. Let's get this off of here. Now we can go ahead and carefully remove that caliper. Once you have it off, it's a good idea to just go ahead and inspect the areas around where those pistons are. If you see any fluid, you know you need a caliper. This one looks okay, so I'm going to set it aside, making sure I put no pressure on the flex hose. Now we can go ahead and grab onto those brake pads. We'll remove those, give them a quick inspection just to make sure they've been wearing evenly. These look okay, so we can set them aside. After that, you're going to find 2 21mm headed bolts. Let's go ahead and remove the pair. Let's leave that in a couple good threads. Fully remove the next bolt. Let's get both of these out of here and remove the bracket. Remove your rotor. The next thing you're going to want to have is a nice collection bucket underneath this area. We're going to spray it down with some parts cleaner just in case it has any anti-seize on there. Now let's go ahead and clean up this area, make sure that it's clean and free of any debris. Once you have the majority of the mating surface cleaned up, you also want to make sure that you get in between the areas of the stud and the hub. I'll just use a wire brush. Give it a rinse. Let it dry. Now it's going to be time to start dealing with cleaning up the bracket. Now the areas that you want to pay attention to are of course the sliders. For this, I'm going to grab onto it, give it a little twist, and pull it right out of there. Now you're going to notice it still has a boot attached to it. We're going to go ahead and take the boot right off of this by grabbing it, twisting it, and sliding it off. After you have it off of there, you want to give it a couple squeezes and just make sure it's nice and soft and pliable and it doesn't look like it's torn or worn or damaged in any way. Once you have it off, let's go ahead and do this. We're going to slide this right on through. And this is going to clean up the boot for us. We'll just go ahead and rub it right along inside there. We want to get out any of the dirt or debris inside there, and even any of the old grease. Give it a little look, make sure it looks like it's clean enough, and like I said, it's not damaged in any way. After that, we'll just go ahead and clean up this slider pin as well. Just wipe down the entire shaft of it. Once you have the shaft wiped down decent enough, you're going to of course want to inspect it. You want to make sure it doesn't look like it's rotted or pitted or it has any type of damage that might restrict the flow inside of the caliper bracket. This one of course looks good, so I would just want to clean it up a little bit better, especially paying attention to the area up where my index finger is. You can see that there's a groove right here. That groove is exactly where that boot's going to sit, and it's important that it's clean and free of any debris so no moisture makes its way into the system. Now this side looks good. I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other side here. Grab onto it, pop it off, slide that off, clean the boot, clean the slider. This slider pin looks good as well. Let's go ahead and set all of this aside. And now we can start cleaning up the bracket itself. The areas on the bracket that you're going to want to pay attention to are of course the slider ports where those slider pins came from. You want to make sure you clean out the entire inner area there. For that you can use a bore brush and some parts cleaner. And then once I'm done that, I'm also going to make sure I clean up this lip right along here. Once again, that's where that boot's supposed to lie. We'll go ahead and do that on this side, and of course on the other side as well. Give it a quick inspection, make sure it's thoroughly cleaned all the way through, and of course if you can see inside there, make sure it's not rusted or pitted in any way. Now that we have the slider ports cleaned up, the next areas that we're going to pay attention to are the 4 areas where the pads are going to sit. You're going to have 2 on either side of the bracket. You want to of course make sure these are clean and free of any debris or buildup that might be in this area, which might restrict the pads from being able to move freely. You can use a wire brush, some sandpaper, or even a light sanding disc. Just be careful not to remove any of the metal for the bracket. Okay, so at this point, all 4 corners where the pads are supposed to go are nice and clean. The next thing we're going to do is go ahead and turn the bracket upside down. In between this area here on both sides of the bracket is where the rotor is going to be going in between, so you want to make sure it's clean and free of any debris as well. I'll use a wire brush. Okay, the caliper bracket's nice and clean at this point. If you want to use some parts cleaner to make it perfect, that would be fine as well. But after that, we're going to go ahead and continue on with some lubricant. Now, once you have the bracket cleaned up to your liking, let's continue on with those caliper slider pins again. I'm going to start with some lubricant, and we're going to go ahead and coat this entire shaft with the high temperature caliper grease. When I'm doing this, what you want to pay attention to is all the way up in this area here where you can see that groove. You want to, of course, make sure you get some lubricant in there as well. That's going to help prevent moisture or debris from making its way inside that caliper slider boot. Now we can go ahead and take that boot. We're going to slide it right onto the pin, all the way up there, and give it a little spin just to make sure the grease has worked its way around. Let's take a little bit more of that grease. We're going to come right inside this slider port, just a little bit. Of course, we did cover that shaft of the slider pin itself. And then also make sure we get along this outer aspect. Just like on the slider pin, you want to make sure that this is lubricated as well. Let's take that pin. We're going to go ahead and slide it in, press it down, and make sure the boot's sitting completely on it. After that, I always just give it a little wiggle. Essentially, I want to make sure when I wiggle it, the boot doesn't just go ahead and slide right off. That would essentially mean that something's wrong with the boot or it's damaged in some way. This one looks fine, so let's do the same on the other side. Let's apply a thin amount of that caliper lubricant to each of these 4 areas that we went ahead and cleaned up on the bracket. This is essentially to help make sure that no moisture makes rust in this area and of course stops the pads from functioning properly. Now it's going to be time to prepare the brake pads for installation. What I always like to do is just use a thin amount of that caliper grease, and I'm just going to go along each of the ears that you see on all of the pads. After you go ahead and put that on, we're going to start putting on those tins. Now when you do this, you're essentially just going to go ahead and slide it right on. And you want to make sure that this tab is facing towards the backing. If you put it in backwards, this could potentially hit up against the rotor, and that's going to cause a horrible noise if it even goes on. Now, since we're in the process of cleaning and lubricating everything, let's go ahead and clean up our mounting bolts. You can see on the threads there's a lot of debris and maybe even some thread locker. We're going to go ahead and remove all of that and then reapply red thread locker to each bolt. Okay, now these look great. Let's continue on with some copper never-sees along the mating surface of the hub where the new rotor is going to sit. Let's get that on there. Now typically when I do this, I like to make sure that the rotor is going to sit still for me. So I just use a spacer and then I use one of my original lug nuts. Let's go ahead and put this on here to hold the rotor so it can't move around while we continue. Let's carefully slide the caliper bracket into position. Take both of our mounting bolts with that red thread locker. We're going to start both of these in. Once they're both started, we can snug them up. After that, torque each of these bolts to 130 foot-pounds. Okay, so now we can go ahead and put our pads in here. When you're doing this, you want to be paying attention to these metallic clips. We just want to go ahead and put the big portion of it in, but make sure that this tab is sitting on the outer aspect. That's essentially what's going to be pushing this pad out and away from the rotor when you release your brake pedal. Let's slide this in. Okay. Now once you have it in, you want to just give it a little wiggle just to make sure it's not stuck in there. If you had to use a hammer or try to bonk it in there in some way, generally that means that your caliper bracket itself isn't cleaned enough. So if that's the case, you need to go ahead and remove it again and then re-clean that bracket. Put on the outer pad the same way you put on the inner. Okay, now it's going to be time to get ready to put on our caliper. Before we do, we want to make sure that those pistons are pushed all the way in. If they aren't, you want to push them both in at the same time. If you push this one in, that one's more than likely going to try to push out, so you want to do them at the same time. After you're sure they're all the way in, continue on with some more of that high temp caliper grease, and we're just going to go along each of these pistons right here, just along the metal aspect of them. Once you have those completely lubricated, we're going to go along the backside of each of these 3 ears. This is going to help with vibration dampening and noise reduction overall. Now once you have all that done, we're going to go ahead and put this right on over those brake pads. Go ahead and slide it down over those sliders and brake pads. It should slide right in. Before we go ahead and put in our mounting bolts, just take a look at your flex hose up here. You want to make sure it doesn't look like it's twisted around like a pigtail or something the like. That could cause a restriction and it's going to cause an issue with your braking. This one looks perfect, so let's grab our mounting bolts. Once again, we're going to start both of these bolts in. Once they're both started, we can snug them up, and then we're going to torque these two bolts to 31 foot-pounds. Resecure your ABS wire to the flex hose. Now we can get this right out of the way. Grab our wheel. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts. We'll bottom these out. Once the wheel's on the ground, we can torque each of these lug nuts to 130 foot-pounds. Okay, let's torque these to that 130. Torqued. Okay friends, we got one side of the brakes done. What's left to do now? Now you're going to want to do the exact same thing on the other side of the vehicle. After that, go ahead and hop inside the passenger compartment and pump up that brake pedal till it's nice and firm. Once you've done that, get under the hood, check your master cylinder. You want to make sure it's nice and full of .3 brake fluid. If it's a little low, just go ahead and top it off with some brand new fresh .3. Close the hood, take it for a road test. Thanks for watching.